you've been told about Jesus' invitation, that he loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, that if you pray a certain prayer, you will go to heaven when you die, that if you commit to following him, you won't have any more problems in your life. I don't know what you've been told, but if you're like most, it was abbreviated or completely misrepresented. The real invitation is aggressive, it's bold, and it takes a healthy dose of God's power coupled with human effort. But it's also for now, not later. Character transformation, not behaviour modification. Jesus invites you to attune your character to his, to possess a heart and life like his. Nobody is saying you can earn it. It'll take God's grace. Nobody is saying it'll be easy. It'll take hard work. But what if you really could attune your character to his, and in doing so, discover a whole new way of being human? If your life feels unmanageable, Jesus thinks he can help.
So we're really going to begin a 2-week process this morning of wrapping up this conversation that we've been in since Easter this week, and then next week's Father's Day, so we'll do some fun and unique things for that. We're going to talk about getting square with your folks, so if you struggle with bitterness with your parents, that's next week. And then on the 23rd, we're going to land this series. And really what we want to start getting at this morning is dealing with this question of, okay, if I decide to take Jesus up on his invitation, if I decide to say yes to that invitation, then what does that look like? Of course, the biblical language there is disciple. We often use the word follower. Some would even suggest the word apprentice. Some would say believer. But should we decide to take Jesus up on his proposal to change us from the inside out, like how do we actually begin to do that? Like what is the process? What are the handles? Cut to the chase, what do we do? And that's really what we're going to begin working on this morning and again in 2 weeks. Remember, we started this series by asking the question, like, what's Jesus' invitation? And of course, we were trying to be a little provoking and saying, is it represented by the Christianity that we all see around us? Is his invitation really about avoiding hell and arriving at heaven beyond death? Is it really that irrelevant in our everyday lives? And what we've been doing throughout, while we're asking that question, is engaging 3 chapters, the Sermon on the Mount found in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus' longest recorded sermon, and then also leaning heavily into the scholarship of a guy named Dallas Willard in a book called The Divine Conspiracy. And what we've been discovering is that Jesus' interest isn't about behavior modification, it's about character transformation. That over and over and over again, the promise of Jesus is, hey, I can change who you are from the inside. I love the metaphor of the onion, that we have these layers. And Jesus is aware that there's this stuff deeply entrenched in who we are, and as long as we just start masking stuff on the surface, we don't really deal with the heart. And so what Jesus illustrates throughout the Sermon on the Mount is how we will begin to look differently and live differently when we allow him to do his heart work on us. What we said on Easter was, hey, if your life feels unmanageable, Jesus would love to help. And that's really the invitation of him. This week, What's been really, really, I don't know if fun is the word, because right, like it's kind of like running, exercising, like is fun the word? I don't know. But what's been super helpful for me this week personally has been to begin to be reminded of why at 19 years old I made a decision to follow Jesus. Because what I've said to myself for years, and what I've said publicly here, especially during this series, is that when you reach this point where you recognize you need a leader and you're incapable of managing your own life, whether that's for super dramatic reasons or what would look like less dramatic reasons, it's all relative. It doesn't mean that we all have to hit rock bottom because of alcoholism or something like that. It just means like when we reach the point where life doesn't feel manageable anymore, that's where Jesus, that's where we find grace. That's the intersection at which we meet Jesus. That's what I've been saying here. That's what I've been saying to myself for a long time. What was helpful for me to remember this week is that when I decided to start following Jesus at 19, I was also making a decision to stop following certain people. That it's really a twofold decision. That any person, any time we make a decision to start following Jesus, we're also making conscious decisions about who we're not going to follow anymore. And I do not mean that as any kind of gross, passive criticism of my parents or my family of origin or the host of friends and teachers and community leaders that poured into my life leading up to 19 years old. I don't mean it like that at all. I welcome the day that my kids come to me and go, Dad, done following you, going to start following Jesus. Like, to me, that's a natural transition. So I don't mean that as a criticism of my parents, not in the least. But it has been a good conscious reminder for me of it's a twofold deal. Listen, I don't know why you're here. I don't necessarily know what every one of your spiritual backgrounds are. So some of you are here because you follow Jesus and you want to grow in that. Some of you are here because you're intrigued by that. Some of you are here because she's here or he's here. There's myriad reasons. There's really one thing that I'm hoping that you'll take from this morning. One area where I want to provoke you, one idea that I want to present to you and challenge you to hold it up to the light and wrestle with it and talk about it and disagree, that's great because that just means you're thinking about it, but to really wrestle with, and it's this simple idea, that whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, you're a follower. Like whether or not you decide to follow Jesus, you're still a follower. That you may not identify yourself as a disciple of Jesus, but you're a disciple. Like, you are taking your cues from someone or from someone's, whether those are celebrities or coaches or teachers or parents. You're taking your cues as to what to value and what to do and how to live and how to engage in relationship and how to engage in sexuality and how to think about yourself and what to see when you look in the mirror. Those are learned behaviors. Like, there's probably very few of you in this room, if any, that would identify yourself as an apprentice because we reserve that word for trades. Plumbing and electrical and things like that. But you're an apprentice, like every one of us, an apprentice of someone or of someone's. Like you're learning from people how to take your cues. Think of it like this: if your kid came home from a night at a friend's house or a day gone, or you came home from work and they looked at you and said, "What's up, yo?" What's the first thing that would cross your mind? Or the third or the fourth or the fifth? Wouldn't you naturally at some point go, where in the world did you learn that? But because we know, like, we are learners. If I called you a learner or a student and someone overheard that, they would assume in all likelihood that you're enrolled in some kind of formal degree program somewhere, right? But you're a learner. If you showed up at your dad's house for Father's Day and his TV was gone, and you started looking around going, interesting, weird, I wonder where the TV is. And you couldn't find it, and so finally you asked, and he said, I got rid of it. And you're thinking, sweet, we're going to watch the Super Bowl on like one of those 80-inch new TVs from Costco. And he went, no, I cut off cable, I got rid of my TV, I'm done watching TV. What would you be thinking? What cult did he join, right? I mean, what influenced that type of behavior change? But here's the deal. I think oftentimes, and here's why I think this is so invaluable, and it's so elementary. Like, no one here is going to learn anything new. To me, it's appropriate in the simplicity of the music this weekend that we're going to kind of talk about the simplicity of following this morning, because oftentimes we talk about a decision to start following Jesus as though that either we're going to follow Jesus or we're going to follow no one. That's not true. It's a matter of who are you going to follow, not if you're going to follow someone. It's a matter of what are you going to learn, not what are you learning, which kind of raises this question of like, what are you learning? In fact, this was one of those weird weeks for me where by Thursday at lunch I scrapped the entire sermon because what I worked on for 2.5 days was this idea of just starting, like, what are you learning? And we, creative team, worked on this whiteboard idea, and we were going to do all this crazy stuff to get you thinking about what are you learning. To make the point, like, your wife may disagree, but you're learning. Like, you're changing. Like, old dogs, it may be more difficult to teach them new tricks, but you're learning new tricks. What are you learning? And even more important, I think, is who are your teachers? I'm learning to swim, which sounds weird. But as you consider what you're learning, let me just tell you a tale. So my history with swimming is neither flattering nor is it very enjoyable. I've always hated to swim. My parents, their summer recreation, my mom grew up with friends who had land on Hauser Lake, and so even growing up in Billings, we came to Helena a few times a summer and hung out on the lake. And so because of that, I think they valued my learning how to swim and my sister learning how to swim. And my sister, she was a fish. She became a lifeguard. She loved the water. I hated it. Several things. I could never get the Jaws theme song out of my head whenever I stepped into the pool. Does anybody else have that problem? If I couldn't see the bottom, that was particularly troubling. Like, I just didn't like that whatsoever. So my earliest memory was at the Laurel Public Swimming Pool, which is not heated. It's freezing cold. And the deep end, it was like 14 or 16 feet deep because they had a high dive and a low dive, not those like little sissy ones that are like built on the ground. Like even by today's standard, like their low dive was high. And so I remember the day, I think I was 4 or 5 years old, hoping I wasn't in 7th or 8th grade. But I remember when it was my turn to learn how to jump off the diving board. And I didn't want to jump off the diving board. Turns out I don't have this need for adrenaline. And so I was mostly disinterested. But my parents, they bribed me and said that I could go to the circus that evening if I would jump off the diving board. And my instructor, Mrs. Easton, who was probably in her 50s, and she had this short, like white, blonde, Swedish hair, like curly hair, which will become important in a second. She upped the ante by telling me that I didn't have to fear the sharks because she would tread water, and I would just have to jump in, and then she would retrieve me and make sure that I got to the side safely. And so I finally obliged, and I walked to the edge of the diving board, and I must have did some calculating, because what I realized there was that the offer was actually far better than I had considered, because Miss Easton was close enough that I didn't have to jump into the water and wait for her to come get me. I could just jump right to her. And so I did. And when I landed, the first thing to hit were my top teeth, right in the top of her scalp. I still remember, like, when the dust settled, seeing this blood coming out of her blonde hair. And we together skirted to the side, and it turns out swimming lessons were over that day. Because I was going to the circus, and she was going to get staples in her head. I don't know how I didn't lose any teeth in the deal. So that's my history with swimming, okay? Like, been water skiing one time. My dad told me don't let go of the rope. I didn't, and I torpedoed underneath the water for like 20 seconds. So it's not a good history. But you'll remember that, last week, if you were with us, I had this kind of self-absorbed whine session about how I've got this stress fracture in my left foot, and so I like to distance run, and I can't run right now. And so I've been telling myself for a long time that eventually that's going to happen. Like, that happens to runners. You go through seasons where you have to stop being obsessive and you have to take a break. And what I've been telling myself is, well, then I'm going to teach myself how to swim. I'm going to throw myself on my wife's Crossroads membership, and I'm going to go to Crossroads, and I'm going to start swimming. I always pictured it being February, not June, but I digress. So this last week, I jumped on her membership. Now, remember, neither flattering nor positive have been my experiences with swimming. So I get in the water, and I'm in shape in my lungs, and so I started swimming. But I made it about a third of the way, and I couldn't breathe, because what I realized is there's a lot of coordination. Because every time I would focus on breathing, I'd literally forget to move my arms. Have you ever had this problem? Because there's all these, there's arms, there's lungs, there's legs, there's feet. It's hard. If you're not a swimmer, this is hard work. And so I was looking pathetic, going back and forth up the thing, miserable, mad. I mean, and about 10 minutes in, this gal walked in who I'm going to guess was in her 70s, and she slid into the pool, and I quickly noted that, everything I wasn't, she was. I mean, I kind of noted that, my side of the pool was pretty wavy, and hers was smooth as glass. And, I could go a third of the way, and then I'd stand up, and I'd spit water out of my mouth, and I'd take a breath, and then I'd go the next third, and she was, back and forth, back and forth. And so on a couple of occasions, I just stopped and, watched her, which would be creepy were it not for the fact that I told you that she was in her 70s. And she must have picked up on that, and so she actually rose and she asked, "Are you single?" I'm just kidding. That did not that did not happen. Instead, she said, "Would you like a tip?" And I said, "Sure, I would take a tip." Now, I'm about as good a listener as all of you are, and so I'm thinking, I'm just trying to focus here. This is about me trying to be in solitude, so yes, I'll take a tip. And she said, "Well, you want to put your head and shoulders in the water." How am I not? And she's like, you're kind of like this. Oh, okay, so I'll get my head and shoulders in the water. Great. And so I'm ready to go, like, okay, I'm done. She said, oh, and she said, and when you move your arms, like you're kind of doing this, she said, you want to keep them close to your body and then reach out as far as you can. Close to your body and reach out as far as, like, can you do that, tap your head, do this circle thing on your stomach? I can't. Like, we don't clap at church. I mean, we can, but I'll never lead you in it because I literally can't sing and clap at the same time. So she says, do this reach out thing. Okay, great. So now I got 2 tips. So I'm literally ready to start going. She goes, okay, and then you want to cup your hands like this. Like, you don't want to do this thing like, okay, so head and shoulders in the water, yep, and reach out, and okay, cup my hands. And then she said, and then when you breathe, you don't want to like do this and look over. Like, you're kind of looking up and looking over. She said, you just roll your shoulders. Just roll your shoulders. Okay, so roll my shoulders. Great. Okay, so I think I'm up to 4 tips now. I said, okay, great, thank you. And then she would like demonstrate. She'd go like 4 strokes. She's like, see, do it like that. Okay, great, thank you. And I'm ready to go. And she says, and then your hips, they should be stiff. Now, like, what does it look like to not have stiff hips? That's what I read a scouting report on a football player, and they'll say he has fluid hips, and I'll say, mine feel pretty fixed, right? Like, she said, you want your hips to be stiff. Okay, I'll make a point. And then she said, and you want your butt to be up, like you're kind of going through the water like this, which my wife had pointed out the day before. Like, how do I get my butt up? Do I arch my back? I don't know. Just get your butt up. Okay, thanks. I'll work on that too. Thank you very much. And then she said, so your hips are stiff and your butt is up and your legs, they need to be straight. Okay? So my legs are straight, my hips are stiff, my arms are up along the side, I'm turning, and then and I'm thinking she's done, and she said, and then with your ankles, you just kind of want to flutter your ankles. Just flutter your ankles. What does she think I am is what's going through my head. So the only thing she didn't say was you'll want to get in the water. Like, she didn't really leave anything out besides that. So I took her tips and tried it a couple times, and then when she slipped out the door, I remembered something from swimming lessons. It's the zip T down. Remember that one? I just rolled over, and I started doing zip T down, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then when I got tired, I'd grab the kickboard, and I'd just... And at one point, one more story here, because this was so horrible. I did 5 there and backs doing the zip T down. I was feeling good about myself. I was almost in that kind of runner's zone where you're not thinking about anything, but you're thinking about everything, and that's really what I'm after. And I took a break because there's no way I'm doing that whole hit the wall, flip around thing. That'd be a neck injury for me. So, and one of those instances where I touched the wall and I stood up to turn around, I stood long enough to realize like the room started rotating on me. Have you had this happen in swimming? Like, I'm starting to get the spins. I can feel them getting the spins. Now I'm thinking, like, I already think people are probably crowded around the camera in the little guest area watching this idiot swim. And now they're going to gather around because the ambulance is going to be here to get this guy who passed out in the swimming pool. So I had to make a decision, like, am I better off in the pool or out of the pool? I decided I want out of the pool, so I climb up the ladder, and I got to the top, and I would imagine this is what it's like when you've been on a ship for a long time. I don't know, but I hit the deck, and I was like, and I think I literally was doing this. And there was a chair like there, and it was 50-50, whether or not I almost crawled to the chair. And I made it to the chair, and I sat down, and then the peanut butter toast started making its way up my throat, and you can feel it. And at this time, it is full on. Like, it was so bad. And I did not go home in an ambulance. All that to say, what do you learn? And who are your teachers? Because I think there's some importance to being reminded that we're learners, we're apprentices, we're followers. There aren't followers of Jesus and followers of no one. There's followers of Jesus and there's followers of celebrities and followers of any number of other people. In fact, there's this famous moment in world history when Jesus said to these 4 guys, hey, come follow me. Let's just read that again. He says, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw 2 others, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Question. I think these kids were like teens. I think John was as young as 10. Peter was probably 18. There's some historical stuff involved there. But no matter how old you think they are, is this the first time in their life that someone's invited them to follow them? Like, is this the first person? You don't even have to know biblical history or know what was going on in the first century. Just knowing what you know about your kids or kids today or yourself or life, is this the first invitation they've had to mimic and model their lives after someone else? No, of course not. In fact, even within their lives, the Bible illustrates this. In John chapter 1, we get another glimpse of this whole story. Speaking of a separate incident, it says this: the next day, John, now we're talking about John the Baptist, the one who wore weird clothes and ate funky food. The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. I think it's valuable to note the fact that Jesus wasn't, even in the first century, Jesus wasn't the only one with disciples. He also had followers. When he saw Jesus pass by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" And this next question, or this next statement, is a reminder that if you've ever asked a stupid question in your life, the disciples are with you. "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi," or a teacher, "where are you staying?" You're asking Jesus one question: "Where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you'll see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We found the Messiah." And he brought them to Jesus. Jesus said to him, we'll stop there. See, I think there's a couple valuable observations here. First of all, other people other than Jesus had disciples. And secondarily, before these guys, Andrew and Simon and James and John, before they followed Jesus, they followed someone else. See, again, oftentimes when we talk about following Jesus, don't we often talk about it as though we're either following Jesus or we're following no one? I think there's some value in going, no, that's not accurate at all. In fact, there's a story of this really successful entrepreneur in the Bible that captures this well. That this guy would have been the envy of the small business leaders in his community. He would have been among the most successful. He would have been the one driving the nice cars and living in the nice houses. And I mean, this guy was a picture of having arrived. This is the guy that when he went to his class reunion, like, he had it going on. And his name is Levi. And in Luke chapter 5, again, all we're basically doing is making these simple observations. In Luke chapter 5, it says this: after Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Now again, let's just pull away the religious artifacts. Has Levi followed people before? Has someone explained to Levi, here's how to run a business? Here's how to exist in a community. Here's how to treat people. Here's how to value money. Here's how to think about women. Has someone taught him that stuff? Jesus says to him, "Follow me." See, his invitation is no different than anybody else's invitation. It's an invitation of who, not if. Of what are we going to learn, not are we going to learn something. And we see this theme play itself out over and over and over again in the text where Jesus, see, oftentimes I think we frame Jesus, I think we often frame him in this way that's not at all accurate. We say that he alone wants our devotion, that he alone wants our attention, that he alone makes demands, that he alone gives commands, that he alone makes statements about good and bad and evil and good and beautiful and ugly and appropriate and inappropriate and healthy and unhealthy. No, everybody has an opinion on that. It's just an issue of whose opinion are you going with. Dallas Willard, one of my favorite theologians, you know that by now, one of my favorite statements from him is he was a philosopher at the University of Southern California. He just died here a few weeks ago. But not only was he a world-class theologian, he was a world-class, in the secular world, if that's the word you want to use, philosopher. And a student one day found out that he was a follower of Jesus. And the student looked at him and said, "Why would you follow Jesus?" Just dumbfounded that this highly respected professor who was very successful, not in a Christian university, but in the University of Southern California, why would you follow Jesus? And his response was, well, who else do you have in mind? It's not an arrogant statement, and he's not, I think, trying to be snarky so much as he's saying, listen, I'm going to follow somebody. I had a conversation with a friend this week who leans really heavily towards the sciences and exact sciences, and in his trade, like there is no probably or 95% sure. It's either yes or no, and lives depend upon him knowing the right answer, and he struggles with Jesus in that regard. I can't know, he said. To which I say, yeah, I'm the wrong guy for you if you're looking for someone to tell you that you can. To me, it's an issue of probability. Like who are you better off learning from? That to me is the question. A friend was telling me this week that she and her husband came to the realization, and this happens to all of us, I think it's part of getting old, but that they were parenting adolescent boys. And she said she came to the realization that she had very little frame of reference because she was raised with sisters, and her husband was raised with boys, but it wasn't all that healthy. And so she made the observation to her husband, like, listen, we've learned how to parent adolescent boys, but probably not very well. We better find a teacher. It's a what? It's a who, not an if. One of my greatest frustrations as a youth worker for those 9 or so years of my life, and it didn't happen all that often, but it happened enough to kind of stick in my craw, so to speak, was every once in a while you would form a relationship with a particular student who you disconnected with, and that works the same way as life works. Some people you connect with easier than others, and it happened a few times where this kid would get involved in leadership and start spending a lot of time with us and doing all kinds of things, and then suddenly there would be this hammer I don't know what I'm trying to say, this clear distinction, and suddenly the culture of that relationship suddenly changed, and it became very clear that their parents were threatened by the relationship. Not in a they were creeped out sort of way, but in a they were jealous sort of way. And it was hilarious and yet extremely frustrating because things would happen. I remember in one case, we did leadership on a particular night, and suddenly, mysteriously, this family started having mandatory family nights on the same night that we would do leadership. And it was frustrating, but what made it especially frustrating was on almost every occasion, it was churched kids' parents who would just start feeling threatened and creeped out or whatever that might be. And I remember processing it with a family member of mine who I really respect and is 10 years older than me and follows Jesus and is a really good parent. And he just said to me pretty bluntly, he said, Adam, when my kids are in high school, I could care less whether or not they're involved in a youth group. Which I appreciated his candor, but was a little taken back by that. And so then I went to Fred, and I was processing all this, and Fred was this friend and mentor of mine, and Fred said, Adam, well, I hope he understands that when his kid is in high school, he's going to need somebody else to reinforce the things to him that his parents are trying to teach him. And Fred went on to unpack, he's got this observational bent that if you haven't taught your kids what you want them to know by the age of 13, you've lost the right to teach it to them, at least for the next 5 or so years. And so he just began to explain, and it's really the language that we're using this morning, that it's around that 12, 13, 14-year-old age where you come to the realization that you don't have to follow your parents, that you've got options. And there are all kinds of people you can choose from, and all kinds of things you can learn, and all kinds of directions you can go. And so his point was, man, to me, the strategic role of youth ministry in that regard is you're hopefully putting a leader in a student's life who is reinforcing to the student what his parents would say anyway, but his parents are idiots at this time in their life, according to the student, and so someone else has to say it. See, we discovered around 13 years old that we have options. That we can follow anybody we want, and that's not just a church kid thing, that's a life thing. John 3:16 is probably a familiar verse to all of us. Let's just look at that. I want to make an observation there. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Thanks to the guy behind the goalpost who's now in prison. We all know that one. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. See, it strikes me that we often talk about Jesus in these terms that say he came and he started telling people, you're going to hell unless you get in line behind me. Now, certainly there are eternal implications to what we do with Jesus and God's grace. But to me, it's much more an issue of, hey, if you're sick and tired of following these systems that don't work, if you're sick and tired of getting your nose bloodied, you've got other options. Come learn from me. You can follow them or you can follow me. And there's implications, profound implications for which one you pick. In the Sermon on the Mount, which is where we're supposed to be, there's this pretty edgy statement. Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate. And this is how he's finishing up what is his longest, most thorough teaching in the Bible. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. I think Dallas Willard, if you're not following along with us in the Divine Conspiracy, points out brilliantly that we're not talking here about doctrinal correctness. Oftentimes we talk about the narrow and the broad road as though like you've got to nail certain doctrines. That's not in context what Jesus is saying at all. What makes the road narrow is that his particular way is a particular way. You could argue that every road's narrow. Every teacher's going, here's the way. Here's what it looks like. And Jesus is simply, he's provoking us on, do we trust him enough to actually obey what he says? That's the issue. Like, do we really believe that his way is the best? One final story in the Gospels that captures this best for me is in John chapter 6. Now, in John 6, Jesus has just taught some rather insulting things, and the result is people are blogging like crazy, and they're leaving the church, and there's all kinds of negative things happening. And in John 6:60, the authors, to me, it's kind of a confirmation that this stuff isn't made up, because if you were trying to make up a book that would glamorize Jesus, you wouldn't make this up. Because listen to this. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? So people who said, I'm following Jesus, were going, I'm not so sure. And in verse 66, it just says, from this time on, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Now, does that mean they're no longer following anybody? Of course not. This means that they're no longer following him. But here's the one that to me is so rich. Jesus said to the 12, he said, you do not want to leave too, do you? And Simon Peter, who would have been his role to be the first one to speak up, that's why we think he was 18. Most rabbis had a senior disciple, and the senior disciple's role was really to provoke the conversation so you don't have those awkward moments like nobody's answering the question. Their job was to go first. Simon Peter said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. See, to me, there's a brand of Christianity that tries to cajole and force and manipulate and even shame. It's just not the way that I read the text. Peter's just like, we've been around long enough to know that there's not a better option, that your way works. So listen, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, you're a follower. And if you're someone here this morning and you're still trying to get your head around that and trying to understand that, I think there's profound permission from Jesus to set aside for a moment whether or not he was God, his exclusivity, like all those kind of things that can be really difficult in our multicultural world to deal with. I think you can set aside all of those things and just try following him. And what I mean by that is get yourself a Bible. And if you don't have one, Guest Central would love to give you one as you leave. And just start reading the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just start trying it. I think Jesus is secure enough to go, come try. Come try to just, treat people the way he invites you to treat people. And treat your spouse the way he invites you to treat your spouse, and think about life. Because listen, that way you spent money this week, that's a learned behavior. And that way that you thought about yourself when he looked at you like that or she looked at you like that, that's a learned behavior. That didn't come by epiphany. Like someone taught you how to think about yourself that way. And when you said that to her or when you made that decision, they're all learned behaviors. The invitation of Jesus isn't so much that we would believe in these otherwise arbitrary facts. It's he came on the presumption that we were struggling to understand how to navigate life. And in what the New Testament makes very clear was God put a body on it. He's truth incarnate. And the reason he's so insanely practical It's because that was his focus. The reason why I have a disdain for being called pastor, and I understand there's an occupational role to it, there's a functional role to it, but it assumes that there's some part of life that are ministry and some parts that are not. In church world, we'll say, are you in full-time ministry or part-time ministry? I say, I'm in occupational ministry. That's as close to that comment as I can get. Because that whole conversation assumes that there's areas where Jesus is and areas where he isn't, areas where he wants to be involved and areas where he isn't. Listen, if you tried to start a church from the Gospels, you would have a very difficult time understanding how to do what we do because his interest was so profoundly everyday practical. If you're not sure what to do with Jesus, my challenge to you is pick up the Gospels. Engage him as a coach, as a leader. I absolutely believe Jesus is who he says that he is, but I kind of work backwards. And I guess I'm just comfortable admitting that we don't really, and this one will make you mad maybe, but I don't think we really care what's true. We want to know what works. And Jesus works. And that's why I think he's true. And I think the challenge to you, if you do identify yourself as a follower of Jesus, is to analyze that title a little bit. And listen, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad about themselves, but I understand about myself the same thing you understand about yourself is it's really easy to put the title on ourselves and to go weeks at a time without ever following him. Because to me, what following him looks like is when we're dealing with a life situation, when we're trying to decide whether or not we should take a job or not take a job, or move to a city or not move to a city, or say yes to this relationship, or not, that we would actually begin to open the text, particularly the Gospels, and go, Jesus, what would you do if you were me? Because the goal is not that you would relive Jesus' life. The goal is that his life would be relived through you. I was at a conference almost 10 years ago now where a guy said, and he was so in your face, a guy named Ray Vanderlaan, a Dutch Reformed guy who could just kind of say it like only those guys can, and he just looked at a conference of about 10,000 of us and said, if you're not reading the Gospels every day, you're not a disciple. And what he meant was, from a historical context, like disciples are people who are they're looking at the gospel, they're looking at their rabbi, and they're going, how do I do this? How do I do this? How do I do this? I'm not going that far, but I am going to say that if you committed to reading the Gospels every day for the next year, you'll be a completely different person. I guarantee it. His challenge was 3 years. A gospel, I think it was every gospel once a month for 3 years, which is pretty aggressive. I made it 2, and I was kind of a jerk. So I think I should have just went with one gospel a month for a couple of years. Meaning like I got so hyper-focused and legalistic about it. Listen, I guess finally there's this. If you're here this morning and you are a Christ follower, and I know that's the majority of you, my challenge is to step back from the title a little bit and begin to analyze, like, are you actually looking to a rabbi named Jesus to understand how to navigate life? Not in a shaming way, but in an inviting way, because that's who he is. That's why he came.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android. For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.